Good afternoon, welcome, and thank you for being here. We are here to present a day of panel discussions about transdisciplinary design. This full day is presented by IED, Istituto Europeo di Design, and UAL, and we have some guests from both institutions as well as special guests. The first panel is going to be about the theory and context of transdisciplinary design and asking questions on what are the challenges that need a transdisciplinary approach and how we should face such challenges. The second one is going to be about education, so how universities are providing young designers with the skill they need to face challenges in a transdisciplinary way. And the third one is going to be about practices, so how real practices in design are using this design methodology in their everyday practice. At the end of the day, we're going to have Nelly Benayoun with her keynote speech. So without further ado, I'm going to leave the stage to the first panel about theory and context of transdisciplinary design. Welcome and enjoy.
Great. Thank you, Jacopo. Grazie. My name is Michael Thomson, Design Connect, and I've been working in the design industries as a design strategist and a facilitator for many, many years, more years than I care to imagine. And it's a great pleasure to be involved, not only on this specific event, but previously with the development of the new transdisciplinary master's programs in Torino, in Milano, at the IED, the Institute of European Design. So it's a great pleasure for me today to introduce to you our panel, which I will basically allow our panel members themselves to introduce themselves, other than to say that we do have Christopher Laing here on my left, architect. We have Joycelyn, who is a very intriguing and interesting person working on the boundaries of different disciplines, and I'm sure she will talk about that. And Riccardo Balbo, who is the director of the IED in Italy, I think, if not the world. So I hope I haven't demoted you. It's the world, okay. He's the director in the world, which is great. So it's fantastic to have Riccardo here. I think, obviously, the topic that we have today, one of the questions that I'm asking, in fact, the question maybe we are asking all of ourselves is, in what way can transdisciplinary design make a difference? And how can we actually think about transdisciplinary design as a way to enable us to evolve the way in which we actually connect to our practice today and practice tomorrow, as well as, of course, academic theory and so on. I'm not an academic, by the way. So I think what I'd like to do, I don't want to talk much more than this now, so what I'd like to do is to introduce Chris. Chris is going to show some slides, and he will then give us a little presentation. I will then hand over to Joycelyn, and she will talk for a little as well. May show a slide, may not show a slide, we'll decide in a moment. And then I'll hand over to Riccardo, and I think we will leave questions for the audience, and we would like to have some questions towards the end of the session. We've got from now till about 4:20, so we are bounded by time, and I'll do my best to keep the time management without making ourselves feel rushed or that we're sort of racing along unnecessarily speedily. So I would like now to hand over to Chris, and he's going to talk to us. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. So, as Michael has said, my name is Christopher Laing, and I'm the founder of Deaf Architecture Front and Sign Strokes. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come along and talk to you all today. So, Deaf Architecture Front, I will explain. Just bear with me. So, within the architectural industry, I want to talk to you about it through deaf eyes. So Deaf Architecture Front is a platform which I established to make sure that we can have open source resources and education across the deaf community to make sure greater access for the deaf community into architectural industries. So as you can see here, there's a plethora of things that we want to cover and provide, but these are the things that we think are very important. So case studies, research, deaf spaces, all of these things are what DAF wants to deal with. So what's the issue? So as part of establishing DAF, I actually conducted a survey with the deaf community, and we asked a number of questions. So one of the questions was, are you able, or do you feel you are able to engage with architecture generally? And as you can see from the statistics, 64% said no. The deaf community also experience barriers when it comes to work experience placements. So for example, I work full-time, so I am able to access government funding for interpreter provision, which is called Access to Work. However, if you were to go into a work experience or you wanted to volunteer somewhere, there is no Access to Work funding available, and therefore, if you are deaf, you will not be able to have access to a British Sign Language interpreter. So Deaf Architecture Front, really, what we want to do, we are in the process of registering as a charity, and one of our aims is to be able to provide funding so that interpreters can be sourced for these young people who wish to get into the architecture industry. Now, representation-wise, there are only about 7 qualified deaf architects throughout the UK currently, and I want to see that change. And as you can see from this slide, 80% of deaf architects actually prefer access to resources in British Sign Language. We also asked deaf architects whether they felt isolated in their workplace and whether they can actually interact with colleagues, a huge number of which said that they couldn't. So obviously you can see here, so we're thinking about how the deaf community can be heard and seen in an architecture space, but we're looking at deaf space as an initiative. This slide just encapsulates all of the services that Deaf Architecture Front will be providing. And again, this is one of the questions, and you can see 72% of the deaf community said that they had never attended a workshop. There are also no British Sign Language established signs for specific architectural jargon and terminology, which is an issue because obviously it just means that there's no way to actually explain any architectural terminology. So what I then also have done is founded Sign Strokes, which is an online resource with British Sign Language that we've come together as a focus group to create specific signs for specific terminology. So on this slide, you can just see on the left, the yellow column are signs that have already been posted online. The blue are ones that we want to be able to devise. However, we can't do that just yet. They've been paused because we now have a lack of funding. We are hoping to be able to get more funding to be able to create the BSL signs for this terminology. And the orange column are future works that we need to be workshopped. Now, what we're also hoping to do is utilise this resource to be able to train interpreters, because at the moment, interpreters don't have any knowledge really or the signs to be able to access the architecture industry with a deaf professional. Another question that we asked the deaf community was, have you been able to go along to a public consultation? Again, the majority of the deaf community said that they couldn't access it or they didn't know what it was. And I'll explain a bit later on why that's obviously such an issue. So Deaf Sightline and Deaf Space. So Deaf Space was actually established in Gallaudet in America, and actually it's just about making sure that a space is accessible for the deaf community. Now you can see the 5 ways architecture can influence a deaf experience of a space. These are elements of what we call deaf space. And these are some diagrams of examples of how they can actually be implemented in practice. So to create the deaf space, what we want to do at DAF is create further resources to be able to upskill, but also empower individuals to ask for what they want, but also educate firms as well and individuals so that they are able to provide deaf spaces. We also asked interpreters and translators whether they have ever worked in an architectural setting, because part of the issue as well is sometimes you have interpreters available, but the deaf community don't come along, and that's due to a lack of promotion. What we want to do is make sure that we remove that barrier of inaccessibility, and we make all of our events and the industry accessible. And this is what I've said earlier, a lot of interpreters and translators are not familiar with any architectural terminology, which can create a bit of an issue. A deaf network is really important so that you can actually have a role model, you can share tips, you can ask for advice, but what's important is to have visibility of that and to encourage confidence. So this is how I envisage DAF working. So the benefits of DAF include sharing resources, collectives, workshops, but also the ability to collaborate and improve well-being within the deaf community. What we want to do is make sure that the architecture industry is accessible but also visible to the deaf community, and make sure it's not a place that they don't feel welcome. Thank you. I think that's everything in a nutshell.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chris. Can I ask you a question about language? I was very interested to see that you're working hard to basically evolve sign language that would accommodate architectural terms. And I think for all of us working in transdisciplinary ways, if that's how we choose to interpret it, the development of language is really important, and language between different communities and different groups. And I just wonder, what barriers have you found to help you as a deaf architect actually work in a hearing community where they don't have the language for communicating with people who are deaf? Would you say there are some critical barriers there that would need changed? If you had a magic wand to wave, what would you wave for those people to help them better understand what you're facing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my first language is British Sign Language, and my second language is English. So, of course, my method of communication is visual, but that within itself can create a barrier for my hearing colleagues. So let's say, for example, gentrification, the term gentrification, I never knew what that meant. And we actually thought, well, the deaf community won't understand what this means. So what we've used is the sign posh and then take over. So we've created a compound sign. So it just means that, in a nutshell, the deaf community are, oh, that's what gentrification actually means. But having to have a focus group to put together these signs and really think it through, this is what we have to do to develop and further evolve British Sign Language. And I think what's really important is the resources, because they're just not in existence at the moment.
That's really insightful. Thank you. Really great to hear that. I think what I'd like to do is move now to Joycelyn, and we can then hear what Joycelyn has to tell us, which is very different to what you've been telling us, and then we can see where that takes us. Chris, thank you very much indeed. Fantastic. Joycelyn, I'm going to hand over to you.
Cool, thanks. Hi, I'm Joycelyn, and I sort of split my design work into, I run an online education platform called ClimateinColour that uses beautiful graphic design to try and educate and make learning about the climate and environmental crises more engaging, accessible and diverse. But I also am a PhD researcher, and I think that's really what I'm going to focus on today in terms of interdisciplinary design. I work in the intersection of ecology, sociology, and computer science, more specifically participatory design, so in the space of human-computer interaction. And my work focuses on how we build technologies for conserving the planet, specifically monitoring biodiversity, but in a just way. So there's lots of different disciplines going on in my research. There's the sort of AI ethics and justice kind of spaces and fields coming in, but there's also the participatory design, the makerly DIY design, there's participatory sensing. I work with acoustic sensors that we embed in the forest, working in community-based design, and so there are lots of different angles at which I come to this work, and I think that I do that because it feels necessary. It feels necessary that as the climate crisis worsens and as the biodiversity crisis worsens and tech seems to become at the center of the solutions that are put forward, especially in forest ecosystems where, say in the global north, they're not homes for most of us. And so the way that we build technology and the way that we deploy technology in forests in the global north are very different to the impacts that are felt by those who live, eat, sleep, breathe the forest in other places. And it sort of seems simple that there would be differences, but the way in which we design, the practices that we have for workshopping in design, and the way that we deploy and build technologies are in many ways, I have found, incongruous with life in the global south, specifically Ghana, where I work. So I'm not really sure what I have on my slides. I'll just have a look. Yeah, so I'll just go quickly to this slide. My work sees me mainly engaging with people, and so I take the sociological as the central part of my work, even though I'm a computer scientist. And this means taking apart sensors, putting them back together again, interrogating how sensors make people feel, how they can engage people more or bring them closer to the environments that they live in, how technologies kind of transform the spaces that they're put in, and then the outputs that we can bring that are based on community needs. And so at the bottom of the screen are two sort of very early prototypes that I'm working on with the community members. And pretty much every part of the design is influenced by what community members feel that they want and need. And so the clusters that you can see are created by a machine learning algorithm that clusters sound. And so I don't know if I introduced that properly enough, but I work with bioacoustics. So these are acoustic sensors that record forest sound, and ecologists use this sound as data to analyze species, populations, whether they're increasing, decreasing, where in the forest species are habiting. So pretty much standard ecological questions, but being answered in a very technological way. And so every dot in the clusters is a 3-second sound file from a 2-hour dawn chorus in the forest. And what the machine learning algorithm does is cluster all of the sounds throughout that whole soundscape that are similar. And as you tweak the machine learning algorithm, the clusters that you see are individual species. And so it's a way of allowing it to become visible which species are in the forest, and then we can sort of do some more analysis on those. But parking that, we wanted to make sure that we were providing a tool that the community members could use to lead their own conservation. And the reason that this is important is that in the Global South, many forest areas, whilst have been historically inhabited by community members through the colonial period, became taken over by colonial administration, and those boundaries and barriers are still in place. And the sort of standard approach to ecology is one in which humans and the natural world are seen as very separate, and that the colonial sort of project has continued in removing people from the spaces in which they live in. And so providing tools that community members can use to take back some of that agency and ownership, and to be able to either collaborate with state actors or to completely take over the conservation of the areas that they've called home and that they work and live in, is an essential project within sort of justice and conservation space. And so we're currently still workshopping and building tools that community members can use to explore the soundscapes in the forest and to use this to inform their actions on the ground. And so I guess I'll pause here and we can talk a bit more about anything that's not clear.
Great, thanks, Joycelyn. I think I'd done a little bit of homework. You sent me some really great links. And I think you've also done some work in deforestation as well, is that right? And mapping change through technology, is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, so the project that I worked on before this main PhD project was using satellite imagery and machine learning to detect deforestation in the Congo. And so that is essentially identifying basic color changes in maps of consecutive years and identifying the threshold for which, you know, a certain hue of green becomes a certain hue of brown, and how that overlays with on-the-ground data about what that area is. So, for example, if there's on-the-ground data that last year a piece of land was a cocoa plantation, and this year it was felled because cocoa works in a sort of slash and burn pattern, where once the cocoa has lasted its 35 years of production, you have to burn that land for it to regenerate again. And so between those 2 years, the satellite image would turn from distinctly green to distinctly brown or even dark black. And so the machine learning algorithms are trained to identify these changes in the landscape. But I think the reason why I moved towards sensor-based work was that satellite imagery and observing from above only tells you so much. And I think this is the importance of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary design, because decisions get made from just a satellite image. And so you could define a piece of land to be biodiverse because it's green, but inside it's silent, and that's not a sign of biodiversity. All the material conditions for the people who live within that forest are not positive, yet on a UN sort of report it would say, yes, great, this piece of land has been conserved. And so that's why I'm taking this new view within the forest rather than above the forest to understand the ecosystem better.
That's great, thanks. I mean, you mentioned, you said a sentence there, interdisciplinary design or transdisciplinary design. And I wonder what your thought is on that, if you were making some distinctions. So, for example, the interdisciplinary design is enabling you to bring together different technologies and methodologies to look at or observe or analyze or evaluate a situation, for example, the forest or the soundscape in the... But do you think we need transdisciplinary design to help us solve the problems that are actually emerging through what you're seeing because of the work that you're doing? Do you think, does that word help, do you think?
I actually do think it helps, and I hadn't thought through it so deeply before, but actually I think that a lot of the experiences I've had doing interdisciplinary design have actually been quite frustrating, because I think that what you're doing is not breaking the barriers between disciplines as a whole, you're just breaking them down in your own work. Which means that the institutions of all of those different disciplines are still very rigid, and you might find certain people who are loose and fluid to that. But I think the transdisciplinary moves further than just individual academics or practitioners sort of bringing together parts of different disciplines that they think are essential to be put together. But transdisciplinary sees just a much sharper blurring of all of those lines and allows us to actually do the work. I think that in interdisciplinary design, you still have to fight against a lot of the disciplinary boundaries which becomes a hindrance to the work, especially when people are so tightly holding on to their boundaries. So say within computer science, it feels like an affront to a lot of computer scientists to be bringing in qualitative methods, for example. Or for science and technology studies, people who are very critical of technology, it feels maybe confronting to have such technical aspects to the work. Whereas maybe in a transdisciplinary space, we would have either transformed the disciplines so that they are capable of holding all of those different methods, or kind of transcended their current boundaries into something that is a lot more fluid.
How interesting. Thank you so much, Joycelyn. I think that's a really nice link through to our final panelist today, Riccardo. And I think some really lovely comments to springboard for you, Riccardo. So welcome. The panel's
Thank you
yours.
very much. Good evening. Good afternoon. No, thank you very much, because both Chris and you were providing me actually the way to completely upset my speech. So that's normal. The thing is, I mean, I'm an academic, and I'm an architect as a background. And the thing is that we should agree at least on the definition of what is transdisciplinarity otherwise. So in order to make the very long story super short, I think we should refer to the theory of complexity, Heisenberg, Einstein, Levi-Strauss. They were providing us a different way to look at things. So it has been a long journey for us where we were able to wear different spectacles in order to look at the same reality with a different, through a different lens and through a different perspective. So basically, the famous sentence that a butterfly can affect the stability of a bridge on the other side of the planet is not because the butterfly is different or the bridge is different, but it's just because we find a way to look at connections among many, many long chains of things that are affecting each other. So that's the thing. Transdisciplinarity, so trans and discipline, it's very important because has this word that comes from Latin that is trans. Trans is a word that brings movement, like translation. I move from one language to another language. Or tray, that is something that I use to move things. Or trading. Or betray, that I transform your truth in another truth. So trans is a movement. So when we say transdisciplinarity, we refer to a discipline that is moving somewhere. So the twin word that we should always consider close to transdisciplinarity is hybrid. When we talk about hybrid, we talk about the status that is melting two or different status into new one. So we take a picture, a snapshot. Trans is not focusing on the effect of a melting of disciplines, but transdisciplinarity is a discipline that is overpassing itself. But honestly, and listening to you, both of you, disciplines are something that are only interesting for educators. Because when you start your job, when you start your research, no one is interested in knowing which is your discipline. Actually, they ask what you are able to do or which is your aim. So it's completely out of focus to talk about disciplines when you are in, forgive me, in the real professional world. So transdisciplinarity is a debate that is very interesting in education. But why is it extremely important? Because multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, or disciplinarity are all interested in how disciplines are interacting among them and which is the effect or the solution that they can provide with different interaction. Transdisciplinarity is playing in a different playground because it's not interested in the interaction among disciplines, but is saying disciplines have to step back. And so the problem is the way we set the boundaries of each discipline and how we are able to erase and blur those boundaries, the disciplinary boundaries. Of course, disciplines are very important because they help us to codify body of knowledge of each area. That is the only way to transfer knowledge from someone to someone else. But once you have been able to transfer this starting kit, the starting bodies of knowledge, we have to try to provide something that is able to connect education to this complexity approach. And that is exactly a different way to look at problems. So today we find ourselves in a position where whether we are aware or not, we are all immersed into a complexity way to look at things. And in fact, we look at things as they look at, that is a super complex, not because it's complicated, but because it has a different perspective to things. But when it becomes to educate people to do what they do, if we use disciplines, interdisciplines or multidisciplines, still we are unable to go there. So we have to break and we have to apply the complexity paradigm shift to education. So to me, transdisciplinarity is the complexity boost to education that of course has to, let's say, pay attention to the super strict boundaries of disciplines that have to protect for very noble reasons, that is transferring knowledge, but on the other side are sometimes too much overprotected, and in fact this is the academic debate.
Yeah, I think sometimes the opportunity for new conversations to emerge or new conversation spaces to emerge gets limited by the boundaries of those disciplines. So discovery, invention, opportunity to think differently about what might be possible, that must be quite difficult for staff in academic institutions where you're saying to them that their precious training and valuable training is not perhaps enough at this point in the game because the way in which the world is changing around them. Has that been a big issue for you in the education?
Absolutely. Starting from Chris, that I met 30 minutes ago. In fact, one of the issues that Chris is underlining is not the difference of language, but is the fact that in his first language, there are missing words. So we don't have words. He doesn't have words for balauster or other things, but we don't have words in education to create a body of knowledge for what she's doing. So actually, it's a matter of language. I mean, he was super good in expressing the issue of missing words rather than a problem of translation. Translation is always betraying a language. Remember that are having the same root, that is trans. So when I translate my language into your language, actually I betray my language in order to make you understanding the concept. So in translation, we have to adapt and interpret. But here we have another problem. We miss words. And those words cannot be found within disciplines. So we have to look outside disciplines, and we have to be brave enough to force ourselves to say, okay, I'm an architect, but look, maybe she is a biologist, and she is a better architect than me in some context. And of course, you have to say to millions of architects in the world that a biologist is better than an architect in some contexts. That is a kind of paradigm shift in the academic and professional world.
Joycelyn, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I think that last comment was really what I think it comes down to, and what makes, I think, people feel uncomfortable, especially when you're bringing in non-academics into academic work. I think it does feel confronting to say that someone who has never interacted with technology might be a better computer scientist than someone who's just spent, all of their schooling in one of the best universities for computer science. And I think that maybe part of it is this obsession with the training, and with a specific kind of Western training that doesn't understand that whilst living in the forest doesn't look like computer science, that a lot of the skills that are learned or that are innate are, and also that innateness, I think, that comes with certain methods that aren't maybe captured by disciplines. feels uncomfortable because you can't just distill it into a list of, a checklist. And I think, at least in computer science, I see this as, okay, so what's the 10 steps to justice, in computer science? And not being able to do that all the time, I think, makes people uncomfortable. So yeah, that's.
And there must, I'm just slightly brainstorming, there must be words that the communities that you work with have to express ideas or concepts about the forest that maybe we don't have. Would that be right, or is that fanciful?
I think actually it might be the other way around, that say take birds and the way that birds are classified, we would usually have the Latin name and then we'd have the English equivalent. And so when we're trying to say classify all of the birds that we have in the visualization, ecologists might say, oh, and make sure to get the Akan traditional name of those birds so that we can identify them. But actually, in Ghana, a lot of birds don't have a specific name. Right. They are known by their call, or they're known by the way that they look, or they're known by some characteristic that they do, but they don't have a separate name. So if you look into the bird guide books, there are loads of blank spaces in the Akan list because a lot of birds will just be called bird in the language, but there might be ways that we don't know how to know birds innately.
Yes, exactly.
And that's the difference in language. It's maybe not a written language or an oral language, but it's a different way of knowing.
Yes. Chris, actually, this discussion has been kicked off by you, I think, with your words at the start. And I wonder, have you anything you'd like to comment on now?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's interesting because, for example, when we look at the written form of a word, that can be quite difficult for us to understand or digest. If we get the visual representation, we get it like that. And I think growing up, it becomes very difficult to be able to learn from the written form of a word. And it's really important, I think, to make sure that we do make sure that people are able to express their thoughts, how they feel. So, for example, in the deaf community, we will tend to use the form of finger spelling a word out if we don't have a specific sign for it yet, because it just means then that people can access that information and people are able to engage or interact. And I think that's really important, rather than pushing people away or making them feel like that space is inaccessible for them. And I think actually just being able to have that BSL translation there means that they're just able to conceptualize whatever we're talking about and then understand it.
Fantastic. I'm loving this conversation. We'll come to a few questions in a moment. So if maybe 2 or 3 of you are thinking about a question you'd like to ask one of the panel members, that would be great. I think I want to ask the 3 of you, if you were starting this conversation now, if you were starting this morning's conversation now, this afternoon, would you start it differently, do you think, if we were trying to address the idea of transdisciplinary design, either in your own universe of activity or on a more broader horizon?
I think mainly when I think on this topic, I come to assumptions, what are the assumptions? And I think that they're always taken for granted in disciplines, and that those assumptions aren't really questioned as to why these boundaries are there, or why do we do things in this way, and why does that mean that this is how we transfer knowledge, and is this the best way to transfer knowledge, and how could we do this better? I think there are a lot of assumptions or traditions as to how disciplines are conducted without much questioning at all, and the current incentives for that questioning are not there for academics. So yeah, maybe I'd start with assumptions.
That's interesting. Riccardo, what do you think? Or Chris?
Well, I think it also comes down to who has the power to change that. So, for example, the initiative of Deaf Space. So, there's not an awareness there of building regulations to make sure that it's standardised to fit in with deaf space. So, everyone's just thinking, oh, we've got to think about a hearing loop, for example, that works with hearing aids. But actually, that doesn't solve everyone's problem. There are all these other factors that should be considered. And it's, we need to fight for that change, but it's who has the power to make those decisions. For example, if I was stuck in a lift in a building, how would I communicate with anybody? How would I get help? If I was locked in a toilet in a building, how would I get help? So there are things there, and they might be simple to other people, but it's those systems that we need to challenge and change.
Riccardo, I thought.
Well, to me, I would say that, it's all about doing things better at the end. I mean, we are here because we are in the, let's say, in the design poetic. That means that design is, we want to do things better. We want to participate to the improvement of the humankind in general. So to me, it's a matter of transforming the focus on application to the focus on implications. And it's applications is fine. I mean, if we don't have anyone that is applying skills in order to get this object working, I can't talk with this loud volume. But what they are showing and what I am trying and with my colleagues in school is trying to make students able to understand that it's not just a matter of application, but it's very important, often more important, the implications of what you do rather than applications on how you do it. And so when you go to implications, you immediately zoom out, you must zoom out, and you immediately enter in areas like Chris is highlighting, that is power, policy making, etc., because it's not just a matter of being a technical human instrument, but it's a matter of being able to diverge, address, and so Michael knows very well what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Well, look, we are short for time. I mean, I think it's clear that any one of our panelists would make a marvelous, could evoke a marvelous half-day or a one-day workshop, and we've literally got 20 minutes. So we've only 5 minutes left now, and I wonder if someone has a question. It's over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Balbo. I'm a PhD candidate from Royal College of Art. Thanks for the presentation. I have one question for everyone in general, because you guys talk a lot of transdisciplinary, but in terms of transdisciplinary design, so what sort of transdisciplinary design make difference in the field of transdisciplinary? Because this one is in general, one is typical, particularly talking about in design field. That might be two complete different things. What make it standing out?
My name is Saskia, and I study product design at the University of Nottingham. And my question specifically for Joycelyn is, would you ever look at using both your satellite and your acoustic together? And then more generally, do you think there is a danger with transdisciplinary within the research field of that if you get too much data, and then is that too overwhelming because you've made some subject matter too large? And actually, is it sometimes better to focus on a particular area, which is the opposite of transdisciplinary?
Okay, so thank you very much indeed. I think we'll take that question first, and then we'll come out to Winbo's strategic question about the distinction between transdisciplinary design and the concept of transdisciplinary. Joycelyn.
Thanks for your question. And yeah, it's definitely great to combine different remote sensing data sets together. So there are many different ways to do that. You can use satellite imagery and ecoacoustic sensing. You can use ecoacoustic sensing and camera trapping at the same time, sort of called the Internet of Trees. And so you can put together any configuration of data that you have access to or the resource to collect. And that allows you to do some interesting analysis and make some different links. Yeah, it's basically just a question of resource, both financially and time-wise. And with the second question, I think there's a difference between working in a transdisciplinary manner within design on a very specific subject than making the subject super wide, if that makes sense. Like, I could be working only in this one specific community for the whole of my entire career and only working on, say, how do we link livelihood with conservation? But the manner in which that work is approached is one that is not rigid and does not sort of hinder other ways of being or different methods of working. So like one example would be that I came into the field with lots of drawn and makerly workshop practices, which are very common in participatory design. Those methods didn't work with the community I work with, and so working in a transdisciplinary way or interdisciplinary way meant that I was able to feel comfortable in setting those aside and allowing the community members to take leadership and run the workshops in a way that was beneficial for them, so that the impact that we made was important, because it doesn't make sense to keep a hold of rigid methods when the outcome is not going to be long-lived. So I think it's less about just increasing how much data is collected and making the question as wide as possible. But it's actually, even if the question is really narrow, making sure that the way that it's approached is in a broad and flexible way. I think that's kind of how I see it.
Thank you very much. I hope that was helpful. Yeah, that's good. Chris, have you had any thoughts in the last 48 seconds about Winbow's question about the distinction between transdisciplinary design and what that might mean, as opposed to the wider, broader concept of transdisciplinarity or transdiscipline? A fine distinction or not?
I'm just trying to, I'm just thinking about how to give a concise answer. I think for me, I'm thinking more about how maybe we should establish a deaf space lab so that we do start looking at transdisciplinary design, because I think, members of the deaf community are not only deaf, they also, they are an intersectional community. So we also need to look at perhaps if they need wheelchair access or other, they have other additional needs, and we need to address those. So I think maybe it's about creating the space to tackle those issues.
That's great, thanks. That of itself is such a massive conversation, and it's such a design conversation as well. And there's so much of that design, I think, that we get wrong now. And I think more transdisciplinary approaches are needed to bring new solutions and new ways of looking at what people can think might be possible in those spaces. I think that's really valuable. Riccardo, do you want to say anything on the distinction? I think it's hard to do in a minute or 2 minutes.
The question the gentleman was posing is absolutely to the point. And in fact, the thing is that design, to me, to us, to a group, to an academic group, it's the best way, because it has all the languages, the tools, and the methodologies to try to, forgive me, to demolish disciplines and to overpass the boundaries. So it's not a matter of finding the difference between transdisciplinarity and transdisciplinary design, but within design, we can find all the tools and the methodologies, not for the design per se, but in order to apply those design instruments to do even things that are absolutely not sharing anything with design. So is transdisciplinarity can be realized through design methodologies. And in fact, it's not about topics or body of knowledge that you share within, but it's about the methodology you apply. That has to open up your zoom in, zoom out, etc.
Joycelyn, do you want a last word? You have the final word.
No, I really agree, and I think that design has all of the tools to tackle transdisciplinarity, and I think that there's at least in comparison to other ways of researching and understanding the world, design holds a lot of flexibility, or at least like hunger for change or curiosity for change. And so whether it's within design specifically or whether it's applying design to wider questions, I think that it's quite a good breeding ground for these conversations. And as Chris said, design can be that lab to start asking these difficult questions.
Fantastic, Joycelyn. Well, it's just the start of the day today. There are further discussions yet to come, and I hope most of you will want to stay for those. I would like you to express your thanks to our panel members, to Chris, to Riccardo, and to Joycelyn. So thank you very much indeed.